So, thank you so much. And good afternoon, everyone, for inviting our guests and our speaker today. And it is with great honor and excitement that I welcome you to this installment of the LCSPX Exploding Galaxies lecture series, States of the Filipino Novel. Born from the collaboration between the Literary and Cultural Studies program here in Ateneo and Exploding Galaxies, in coordination with Critica Cultura and Plume, this talk aims to illuminate the past, present, and of course, the future of Philippine fiction. This afternoon, as we continue to celebrate Women's Month, to all the women, Happy Women's Month, we focus on one of the most remarkable voices in Philippine literature, Linda T. Casper, and the invaluable contributions of women novelists like her to our literary heritage. For us, Linda T. Casper is a name that deserves both recognition and reverence. A novelist of great depth and historical insight, she has dedicated her literary career to chronicling the complex and often turbulent history of the Philippines. Through her novels such as Three Cornered Sun, which Exploding Galaxies has recently published, she has masterfully depicted the struggles of Filipinos under oppressive colonial rule and social upheaval. Her works are not just narratives. They are acts of witness, records of resilience, and testaments to the indomitable spirit of our people. Many of her works, along with our speakers, Dr. Pantoja Hidalgo's materials, are archived in the Ateneo Library of Women's Writings. And hence, it is an honor for me to introduce our speaker as well, because their works ensure that future generations can continue to study and appreciate their invaluable contributions to Philippine literature and society. Historical novels are essential to our understanding of who we are as a nation. They remind us that history is not just the dates and events, it is about the people who lived through them, the choices they made, and the legacies they left behind. In revisiting these stories and the works of other women writers, we engage in a crucial act of reclaiming voices that have long been marginalized, expanding the literary canon to reflect the richness and diversity of Filipino experiences. So, this afternoon, we are privileged to have Dr. Cristina Pantoja Hidalgo, a literary scholar, author, and champion of Philippine literature, and of course, Mara Coson of Exploding Galleries, whose work in publishing continues to amplify women and many others in their literary voices. And hopefully, this afternoon, they will take us through a very insightful discussion on novels and the broader landscape of women novelists in Philippine literature. This lecture series is driven by an urgent mission to reassess the state of Philippine fiction, bridge the gap between academia and, of course, the creative industry, cultivate a deeper appreciation of our literary heritage, and, of course, expand the reach of Filipino writers, not just here in the Philippines, but also abroad. So I don't know if we have online participants outside of the Philippines, but we hope that by participating in this event, we are all contributing to this vision, ensuring that the stories of our nation remain alive, relevant, and more importantly, widely read, especially this day and age. And as we commemorate Women's Month, let us also reaffirm our commitment to uplifting the voices of women writers who are sharing the literary landscape. So, I welcome you all to this talk and thank you again. Happy Women's Month.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Santos. Now I'm introducing our guest speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Cristina Pantoja Hidalgo. She is a writer of fiction and nonfiction, a critic and a literary scholar with more than 40 published books. She has received multiple literary awards, the latest being the Southeast Asia Wright Award for Literature in 2022, an international award granted by the Royal Family of Thailand. She's also received national awards for lifetime achievement, the Carlos Palanca Dangal ng Lahi Award, the Gawad Balagtas Award from the Union ng mga Manunulat sa Pilipinas, the Parangal Hagbong from the USC Varsitarian, and many Palanca Awards, including the Carlos Palanca Grand Prize for the novel, and the seasoned academic cultural administrator, having served as VP for Public Affairs of the UP system, Director of the UP Press, and Director of Likhaan, the UP Institute of Creative Writing. In USC, she served as a Director of the USC Publishing House and at present is the Director of the USC Center for Creative Writing and Literary Studies. She continues to teach creative writing and literature as Professor Emeritus of UP Diliman and Professorial Lecturer in UST. Aside from the book being launched today, she has published more than 40 books. A new book, The Lamplit Desk, will be released by the USC Publishing House later this year. Everyone, let's welcome Dr. Hidalgo.
Hi. Is it okay if I remain seated? Okay. Can you hear? Okay. So good afternoon. My topic is the modern Philippine historical novel in English. I will talk about I will present some examples or mention some examples of novels written by Filipino women, including Linda T. Gasper. So when we Filipinos began writing literature in English, it is the short story in which we excelled. It has had a remarkable, almost phenomenal growth. As a distinct literary form, it was born only 15 years before the outbreak of the Pacific War. And yet in that year, the story Dead Stars by Paz Marquez Benitez, which is considered the first modern short story, was written and published. The novel in English took a little longer to develop. As late as 1965, Leonidas Benessa claimed that while doing some research for a lecture, he found only 11 novels published from 1941 to 1962. But in 1989, Joseph Galdon listed about 90 novels published between 1921 and 1979, including those serialized in magazines like the Weekly Women's and the Philippines Free Press. Half of these were published during the period that Benessa covered in his own research. So what might account for the disparity? It is possible that many of the novels that Galdon found were never published as actual books. They were just serialized in magazines, or they may have gone out of print by 1965. You probably know that our publishing houses very seldom go beyond the first printing. Even today, the first print run for a novel would be in English would be 1,000. And it will take several years to sell out that print run, if it sells out at all. No? Back in the 60s, oh no, there's another, I have an update for this number of novels. In her groundbreaking book, Bibliography of Filipino Novels in English, from 1901 to 2000, published by the UP Press, Patricia May Hurilla lists 177 novels in English published in the 20th century, even if she included only titles published in book form, thus excluding all the serialized novels. This was her breakdown of the titles by decade. Published in the 20s, 5 for the whole of the 20s. For the 30s, 6. For the 1940s, 4. This was when the war took place. No? In the 50s, 12. In the 60s, 18. In the 70s, 19. In the 80s, suddenly, 51. And the 1900s, 59. The number of novels published in the 1970s seems to suggest that martial law made no difference for novels for writers of fiction and publishers of novels. Hurilla suggests that the one reason that she might give for the strict I'm sorry. Hurilla suggests that one reason for the big increase in the number of novels would be that the magazines were closed down during the martial law period, and so there was no venue for publishers to serialize novels. Back in the 1960s, both writers and critics seemed to have the same explanation for the limited number of published novels. They said that one reason was that fictionists were still writing under the shadow of Jose Rizal and his two great novels. Henry M. Gonzalez, for instance, wrote that, quote, "The much sought relevance of history to fiction has become a special feature of the milieu in which the Filipino novelist works. It is expressed in the call for the great Filipino novel." And Bienvenido Lumbera observed that the contemporary Filipino novel in English has inherited from the Noli and the Fili an allegorical tradition by which the personal lives of the central characters pattern out the theme of Filipinas, or the growth of our nation. So, excuse me. The problem, Lumbera added, was that very few, and I wish you would comment on this later, no? Lumbera said that the very few historical novels were actually being produced, and his explanation for this was quite interesting. He believed it was the alienation of the writers in English from that part of the national experience that antedated the literary use of English. And I quote here, "Our English writers' sense of alienation from the past will begin to decrease as the Filipino writer ceases to feel apologetic for his use of a foreign language, and for indeed there are many ways that the returning native can take toward home, and the use of our history opens one of those." As Caroline Howe has noted, many critics point to, and this is in quotation marks, nationness as an important element of Philippine literature. But they are vague about what this nationness might mean and what specific relation exists between literature and nationalism. She came to the conclusion that this nationness referred to thinking and feeling the nation. And by 1998, this seemed to be precisely what preoccupied contemporary Filipino novelists in English. This expressed itself primarily as a bias for historical fiction on the part of writers. But what exactly is a historical novel? In my view, it does not refer, it used to refer to novels set in the remote past, no? And with real life men and women as characters. But I don't agree with this definition. My own definition of a historical novel is the sort that Petronilo Daroy was referring to when he described it in 1968 as, quote, "assimilating history into the texture of the narrative rather than allowing it to remain a passive backdrop." History here is not, therefore, just setting. It enters into the motivation of characters. It propels the plot. The characters in these novels are political beings. Their conflicts are engendered by political events. I would even claim that in some of them, the protagonist is the nation itself. The real conflict its desperate struggle for survival. Elmer Ordonez, in an essay published in the Manila Times in August 2010, identified two novelists whom he considered the first writers of the country's modern historical novels. The first one is Francis Sionil Jose. The second one is Linda T. Casper. Both had written, by the time that Elmer wrote this, both had written 10 novels each. Jose's novels constituted the saga of a Filipino clan named Samson, though these were not published in what would be their proper chronology. The first of Jose's novels, titled The Pretenders, was published in 1962. It was set in a not very distant past and dealt with Antonio Samson, who, despite his PhD in history from Harvard, never quite fit in with the mestizo oligarchy into which he had married. His humble beginnings got in the way. His ancestors were poor farmers in the Ilocos who had to migrate to Rosales in Pangasinan only to become tenants of a Spanish hacendero. He realizes, this Antonio Samson, that whatever he does, the highest he can go in the social ladder is to become a technocrat for his in-laws. Linda T. Casper's first novel, on the other hand, is titled The Peninsulars. With the three-cornered sun and the stranded whale, they constitute a trilogy. These novels cover roughly the periods before, during, and after the 1896 revolution, involving two colonizing nations. The lives of the characters are intertwined in the corresponding historical events that take place. So T. Casper has also written novels about the martial law period and EDSA, but she herself defines these works as historical novels written in their own time. Elmer Ordonez cited T. Casper on her rationale for the historical novel. She wrote, "In history, we see our country unfolding. In literature, we see our lives unfolding. And we feel and share the experience of sacredness as during the Revolution of 1896 and the Philippine Revolution, the Japanese occupation of the 40s, martial law, and EDSA. In that experience, it is that experience which makes us a nation, though remaining our individual selves. The sense of self is what that nationhood is." He also cited Leonard Casper's statement. He named this kind of fiction, which is set in a historical time with characters who supposedly belong to that period, whether fictional or real. He called that kind of fiction true fiction with a hyphen. True fiction, as historical fiction has come to be known, lies in its ability to convert events like the Revolution of 1896 or of 1986 into eventfulness experienced by persons often unknown, as well as to suggest what might have moved within the chambers of the hearts of those already famous. Both Sionil Jose and Linda Casper wrote in the realist style. The latter in particular devoted a great deal of time in meticulously recreating the past. The historical novel, I think, came into its own in the 80s and the 90s. But it must be noted that many of the modern and postmodern historical novels are not historical novels in the traditional sense. In other words, they are not like the novels of Francis Sionil Jose or Linda T. Casper. They are examples of what Linda Hutcheon has called historiographic metafiction. That is, fiction that is not just about history, but about the writing of history, where novelist and historian write in tandem with others and with each other. Let me say a little more about this. It is now a truism, of course, that history does not really give us so-called objective facts. We know that the historian's position in his own place and time, his ideology, and his chosen verbal strategies will determine what he or she chooses to write and how they will write. And as R.G. Collingwood has noted, both the historian and the fictionist construct a picture which is partly of narrative events, partly a description of situations, exhibition of motives, and analysis of characters. Despite their differences, however, post-structuralist history and realist fiction call attention to the fact that there is no such thing as real knowledge, only conventional knowledge. Realistic fiction, like post-structuralist history, is in this sense more truthful. According to Brenda Marshall, the postmodern awareness is that both history and literature are discourses, and thus not to be talked about in terms of truth as much as in terms of whose memory, whose truth. History then may become what Foucault called counter-memory, the process of reading history against the grain, of taking an acknowledged active role in the interpretation of history rather than a passive viewing role. Counter-memory intervenes in history rather than chronicles it. The intervention is precisely the role of postmodern literature, which Linda Hatchon has called historiographic metafiction. Among the most striking examples produced by Filipino novelists in the 90s are among the most striking examples by Filipino novelists in the 90s are Nick Joaquin's Cave and Shadows, published in 1983, Alfred Uson's The Great Philippine Jungle Energy Cafe, published in 1996, and Erwin Castillo's The Firewalkers, 1992. These three authors utilized popular literary forms, the detective story in the case of Nick Joaquin, the fairy tale in the case of Erwin Castillo, and the mock epic in the case of Uson. And they appropriated techniques and strategies of modernism and postmodernism and marvelous realism to tell, excuse me, and appropriate their techniques in order to tell a story that is true. True here is not to be taken in just the sense of rendering events that actually happened, or including characters that actually existed. It is in the sense of seeking to capture another reality, a reality previously silenced or ignored. And they drew from mythology and legend, which lent depth and resonance to both their chronicles and their fabulations. Allow me to say a little about the Uson book because I think it best illustrates what I mean. This novel, The Great Philippine Jungle Energy Cafe, is a tour de force, a multi-layered cinematic extravaganza, both comic and mock-heroic, fantasy and history. Its chronology is disarranged, its language multi-textured. Robert Aguinaldo, that's the name of the protagonist, Robert Aguinaldo decides in 1984 to do a film on the life of an obscure hero who actually existed called Leon Quilat. What begins as slapstick moves through legend and poetry into the magical area of myth. Quilat's Odyssey is juxtaposed with Aguinaldo's. Leon Quilat, no? Quilat's Odyssey is juxtaposed with Aguinaldo's and interrupted by excerpts from a historical text about the legendary cult figure Buhawi. Aguinaldo drops the movie idea at some point in the novel and decides to do a novel instead. His own travels to Dumaguete and Cebu parallel the travels of Kilat. The latter's joining of the CCC, which turns out to be the KKK, parallels Aguinaldo's joining of Ninoy Aquino's funeral cortege. The two realities come together as time collapses. Kilat meets actual people like Marcos and fictional people like Julius Ruiz in Manila, then returns to Pilar in Karkar and is assassinated. But as predicted by Buhawi, he finds his way to heaven, that is the great Philippine Jungle Cafe, where ilustrados, living and dead, and other cult figures like James Dean are gathered in celebration of life. Let us now turn to some Philippine novels by women writers, which I would consider historical metafictions. State of War by Ninochka Rosca, published in 1988, compresses the whole of the country's history, reinterpreting the colonial experience in the context of the present, the present of the novel, no? Which is the martial law period. This is done through interlocking passages of memory, dream, with historical effects. She balances allegory with personal history in the relationship that exists among her three major characters, and whose genealogies and symbolic stories intertwine in a series of historical wars and developments that are symbolized by a 24-hour period of festivity and political conspiracies. The interrelated carnivalesque of making merry and political conflicts is emphasized by the narrative pattern and design as supremely, and also by the structure of the novel, which is divided into three parts. Part 1 is called the Acts, Part 2, Numbers, and Part 3, Revelations. Many critics have mentioned the echoes of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, his 100 Years of Solitude in this novel, but I think its narrative mode owes as much to Nick Joaquin. Gerald Burns has noted that what the novel evokes is the tradition of revolution and resistance. And Gerald Burns has written, ultimately then, the novel construes martial law as an extreme manifestation of a long-standing distortion of Philippine life. Indeed, the state of war itself, at first identified with the current civil crisis, is eventually said to have existed for 400 years. To defeat the current regime is to take the first necessary step toward the recovery of purity and innocence of that young world which, before strangers from across a turbulent ocean broke through to it, had names only for virtue and none for property. I am including here another novel by Linda T. Casper. I'm losing track of all the names. Not the one that we're going to talk about later, Mara and I, but this one is titled Awaiting Trespass, and it was published in 1989, so during martial law. No? The novella by T. Casper takes place entirely during a 3-day wake for Don Severin. The passion or passion, she calls it Awaiting Trespass, a passion. So she's referencing our passions. No? It takes place entirely during a 3-day festival wake for Don Severino. The Passion or Passion is an account of the life of Christ, as we know, focusing on his passion and death on the cross. According to critic Cecil Mojares, the Passion has a ubiquitous existence in our literary history. It appears as a printed text and has been called the Filipino Bible. It is read aloud or chanted during Lent. a practice called pabasa, and it is dramatized on stage. And the historian Ray Ileto, who studied the Passion as an alternative to mainstream history, wrote, before the abolition of prior censorship by the Republicans and the American colonial governments, the Passion was one of the few literary works available to the rural population, and therefore could not fail to shape the folk mind. Its impact is derived from the fact that, in the course of time, it co-opted most of the functions of the traditional epics. By giving her novel this subtitle, therefore, T. Casper was making a point of its connection with ritual and tradition, and with the idea of sacrificial death. Telly and the priest Sevi form a strange bond. Telly is the protagonist of the novel, and Sevi is the son of the dead man. No? It took place during a wake. Telly is his niece, and Sevi is the dead man's. Excuse me. The dead man's. Telly is the dead man's niece, and Sevi is his illegitimate son. Telly and the priest form a strange bond, and rejecting anger and hatred, embrace the inextricable link between their individual faiths, the family's faith, and the country's faith. In style, it straddles the boundary between realist and non-realist fiction, with its truncated narration, time shifts in point of view, and incursions into poetry. Yeah, I have to include this. It's really important. I was thinking maybe I'd skip it, but anyway. The one of the main characters of I've shifted now to Gina Apostol, no? And the novel I will talk about is Insurrecto. One of the main characters is called Magsalin, which translates into translator. One of the characters, Magsalin, the character at the center of Gina Apostol's thrillingly imaginative and provocative inquiry into the nature of stories and the unfolding of history in our collective consciousness, asks, I wonder if we are stuck in bad movie plots which we wrote ourselves. The remark is made in one of many tense conversations she has with an American filmmaker, Kiara Brasi, who has come to the Philippines to shoot a movie based on her father's experience in the 1970s, and of making a film herself about the notorious massacre of 1901. No? That's the Balangiga massacre. Magsalin reads Kiara's script and objects not just to the accuracy of certain details and viewpoints it adopts, but to the very motivation behind it. A Filipina translator and mystery writer, on her first visit to the home country after many years in New York, she decides to put things right by writing her own script. In this struggle, narrative strands collide. History doubles back on itself. Characters, real and imagined, merged into one version of events, only to be pulled apart again by Magsalin's constant interrogation of Kiara's and her own understanding of the history of the Philippines. As we follow the two women's competing ideas on how and why we retell history, the question of whose version should take precedence gives way to a meditation on whether that story, or indeed any other story, can make any difference to our lives. At the heart of the novel lies the massacre of 30,000 Filipinos by American troops in Balangiga in retaliation for the killing of 30 American soldiers in an uprising of nationalists. The notion of insurrecto and insurrection at the time had a negative connotation. No? Rather than, for example, call them freedom fighters. Freedom fighters. One of these so-called insurrectos is the real-life figure Kasiana Nacionales, who actually lived, who becomes the protagonist in Magsalin's script. So there are two scripts being written at the same time, simultaneously. And the fictional Cassandra Chase, an American who photographed the bodies of the murdered Filipinos, figures prominent in Kiara's version, collide. Who is the true protagonist? Which of the writers has the stronger claim to historical or cultural authenticity? To some extent, the novel is tackling the issue of cultural appropriation, but it never ventures close to anything like a crass attempt at resolution. Instead, using the complexity of its narrative and thematic structure to hint at the difficulty in understanding the confluence of history, power, and the individual. None of it is designed to be easy on the reader, and the organization of the novel constantly gives the impression of being in search of something that lies just beyond the grasp of total comprehension. In describing her film script, Magsalin is also describing the novel that we are reading, a conscious articulation of the way Apostol is trying to reconfigure how we think of the historical novel. Eventually, the reader sees through the contradictions between the aloof Kiara of today with her designer clothes and the vivid portrayals of her as a child in the 70s through Kiara's mother's eyes, a lifetime of pain and estrangement, and ultimately a mirror of Magsalin's own life. This impulsive, clueless spiritual adventure is so enjoyable to read, but it is also dead serious. Insurrecto is about the perspective and what lies beyond the frame of the camera lens. These women's stories are an accommodation of the disparate strands that destabilize previous narratives. They pose questions about narration and who gets to do the narrating. One person's insurrectionist is another's freedom fighter. The book's title proudly reclaims the label insurrecto, a catch-all term for the enemy. In the name of Cassiana Nacionales, the real-life character and soul woman who joined the Balangiga Rebellion, but about whom very little is known. Within the pages of Insurrecto, art meets history and is found lacking. But in its rough-cut structure, the book about a film with a void at its heart is a crucial reminder of those who are written out of our official histories. The subtext is serious, and the book's narrative games make the reading experience interesting. Allow me to say something now. It's the end na. Allow me to say something about one of my novels, Recuerdo. In its present form, it took 1 year to write, but it had been part of my life in various guises for many years. I had been working on it for what I hoped would be my first novel. I had been working on it for what I hoped would be my first novel in Bangkok, Seoul, Rangoon, and New York City. On July 13, 1994, I wrote in my diary, "The morning before going to that meeting, I decided to work a bit on the novel. I retrieved my files, the unfinished stories, and realized that a number of them are actually about the same woman, Amanda. So I appended them to the file named Novel. What I had at that time was still in fragments. How to weave them together? What is the story I really want to tell? They all seem so banal, so bourgeois. Yet another story about yet another alienated middle-class woman. No, it must be more than that." This is what I wrote in my diary. No? Another entry dated 19 July reads, "I want to write that novel, but I'm not sure what I want to write about. The idea I had about Amanda and the other person, I don't remember who the other person is anymore, is maybe not it. Something pushes me toward history. Maybe it's a historical novel I want to write. Not really. more like a tales my mother told me kind of thing, but as a novel, a kind of novel. Maybe I don't know how to write a realist novel. Maybe I can't write a novel. Maybe I can write something like Woman Warrior by Maxine Hong Kingston. So that is how Recuerdo got started. I made my mom tell me more stories. I forgot to mention that when I came home, my husband and I came home from living all over the world as part of his work. My mother was 80 years old, and she was sitting down to write her memoirs at age 80 using an electric typewriter. She would not allow us to buy her a computer. She said she didn't want more machines. So I made my mother tell me, oh, it's like this. I asked her if I could read her memoirs, and she said no. You have to wait until it's all finished. And when it's all finished, you may read it. Anybody in the family may read it, but on one condition, it is never to be published. I felt bad about that because my mother was a writer too. She was a writer first. Ako yung two. She was a writer first and was in fact one of the first women journalists in the Philippines. She wrote for the newspapers. I think it was the Philippines Herald during the Philippine Commonwealth. So, yeah, that was before the war. I'll continue reading my diary to you, whether you like it or not. Something pushes me toward history. Maybe it's a historical novel I wish to write, no? Oh, tapos na pala yun. So my mother allowed me to read parts of her memoir, no, but not in a consecutive. Basta this part and that part, ganon. And then I decided to do some research in the library because some of the people she was writing about are people that are kind of well known. And to my astonishment, I found some of my ancestors in those library books. So the novel began to take shape. I wanted to tell two stories, one about Amanda and one about her family. The family story is haunted by violence and death. All the men die, leaving the women to cope as best they can. And I realized that it would also be, in a way, the story of our country. I thought of having the mother tell Amanda the stories about the family, the fictional mother. I thought of her telling all her stories about the family to her daughter, Amanda. So ako yung Amanda here. To help her understand why she had to come home. I'm quoting again from the diary. In December, the novel acquired a new character, the historian Rafael. This gave me an idea for a new twist to the Amanda story. Amanda, my wounded heroine, would tell the historian the stories her mother had told her, and he would help her heal. I brought them to Baguio. Yes, that's my power place, Baguio, and introduced them to another character, Baby, the clairvoyant daughter of a Kalinga leader who had a degree in economics and was also psychic. I actually knew a woman like this in Rangoon. I got her to agree to teach political science, I think, to the International High School where I was also teaching. Anyway, what to call her, no? Hindi naman siya aswang. Healer na lang, healer. This healer and Rafael would serve as guardian angels for Amanda. They would also represent life, community, a kind of love. Meanwhile, as I continued doing my research, I kept uncovering my ancestors. In February 1995, I wrote in my diary, the writing of this novel is very strange. I am living what I write, writing what I live. My discoveries are my heroines. I am digging into the old books in order to give my heroine a past, but in the process, I am finding mine. Talk about the blurring of barriers between reality and fiction. Such a cliche. kasama yung such a cliche dun sa diary entry. So in fairness to me, I had self-awareness. On March 3, there is this entry. The pattern has been like this. I write about 100 to 120 pages and then I switch gears, follow a different path, discard a major character. The structure is more or less stable though, alternating chapters of journal entries and my mother's tales. The journal records the narrative now. The tales retrieve the past. I started out with Amanda and two friends and a nameless young man, Amanda's student. Then I dropped the friends and the students and brought back Amanda's sister. Then I dropped the sister and quite by chance found Rafael. Rafael then gave up. Oh, and then she gave up Rafael and recalled the friend and the young man anyway. Rafael refuses to go away though. I have the feeling that he really belongs to the novel. Last week, I had convinced myself that he didn't, but he would bring an irrelevant complication and lead me away from the story that I wanted to tell. Maybe I was simply daunted by having to tell his story and mesh it with Amanda's. By May, I had decided what was wrong with the novel. It was the structure. It was too contrived. The now was being manipulated to fit into my scheme and complicated by journal entries and notes and bits of poetry. The now, I decided I would have only two characters in the now, Amanda and her daughter, who would be silent the whole time. So the novel develops in a series of letters, but they are actually emails, and they are all sent by Amanda to her daughter, who is a student at UP, but that girl never answers. I mean, the answers are not contained in the novel. So therefore, the now would just be a frame for the then. The story being told is really the story of the family and in a way, the story of the country. I would concentrate on getting the mother's voice right and forget about the Amanda Rafael story. But Rafael I set aside with great reluctance. I shall tell his story some other time. In July, Rafael returned with a vengeance. The idea of writing an epistolary novel came to me at the time. Amanda would write to Rafael these emails explaining why she had left him in Baguio without settling anything. And part of the explanation would be the retelling of the mother's tales. Anyway, just before Christmas, I wrote the last word. And I printed out two copies, one for me and one for my good friend, Neil Garcia. And I asked him to give me his opinion. I would never show a manuscript to Butch Dalisay because I'm too scared of him, of his opinion. I know that he's the superior writer, so I don't dare show him my work. And Neil is a poet. So who cares, right? He doesn't know anything about writing a novel anyway. But by that time, I realized that what I had written was a real woman's text, which was maybe what I wanted to do in the first place. And the last chapter, which is a letter to Rafael, telling him that this is her novel. And after that, I finally did the last draft and gave it to Laura Samson, the director of the UP Press. And this is my last word about it. I have put into recuerdo many of the things I believe in and many of the things I am trying to understand and come to terms with. In a way, this novel has been for me a coming to terms. A coming to terms with helplessness, personal and political, with entrapment, with loss. It is about memory. It is about love. Love between men and women, love of mothers for their daughters, love for the beleaguered and benighted homeland. And ultimately, it is about the strange connections between literature and life, connections which became mysteriously, marvelously clear to me as I wrote this novel, and which I continue to discover to my growing wonder every day.
So Mara Cosson is a writer based in Manila, Philippines. She is a publisher of Exploding Galaxies, a press focused on publishing out of print Filipino fiction and co-founded the Manila Review. Her novel, Aliasing, was published by Bookworks in 2018.
Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Jing Hidalgo. It's nice to be next to you again. So, Jing and I have had 2 dinners now. And so, as a new publisher, it's actually really great to be able to be in her company. In those 2 times, I've actually learned a lot. In addition to her writing, of course, I've also learned a lot about publishing and writing. So, I'm actually happy that we'll now do a little conversation. I guess similar to our more casual dinners. And so, um, okay, yeah. So, what I find really interesting is actually, recuerdo, because when in the novel, I thought that was really interesting. Because in the novel, I couldn't help but think that it was a stand-in for yourself, you as Amanda, and in the novel, your parallel speaks to her mother, and her mother says, "If I don't write these stories, they'll be gone." And so, when you were also telling me about El Chino Tomas, your ancestor, the cellist in your family, and then also the Zarzuela actress, I couldn't help but kind of connect you to the novel, and then to the character in the novel, and then also it reminded me of what Linda T. Casper had also said about publishing her book. It's she was urged by her grandmother to write these stories. And so I noticed that also with your journal entries, you were saying that you had this urge to write this novel. So I guess my question is, in completing a novel like Recuerdo, in the same way as Linda T. Casper has completed the Three Cornered Sun, or other novelists like Gina Apostol, who had written a very personal novel, her latest one, La Tercera, about the loss of her mother. Does putting your family's stories into fiction, in a completed work, fulfill that duty or fulfill that impulse?
I never saw it as a duty. I'm trying to remember when I started out. I wasn't intending to write about my family. I just wanted to write a novel. Later, by the way, I think I mentioned this to you. I later found out that is not my first novel, pala. When it came out, everybody called it my first novel. I also thought it was, and then I don't know why. I had to look through my old magazine clippings of all the store. I started publishing when I was in third year high school. I mean, in national newspapers. No, I'm not counting the school paper. I was writing articles for and then I forgot how this will tie up to your question. Your question is, did I satisfy a need when I wrote about my family? Oh yeah, that's why I was saying no. Writing was in my blood. My students tell me that when they announce they're going to enroll in creative writing as a course, the parents are upset and tell them why. Why of all things. This was not a surprise to anybody in my house that I wanted to be a writer. There was no course such as creative writing, as you know, no? We would have to major in literature. I majored in philosophy. But I really wanted journalism anyway. So writing is just second nature to me, I think. Now, here's the thing. I had no idea how interesting my ancestors were pala as a novelist, no? Because they kept so many secrets from us, our parents. For example, there was this man who was, we believed he was the brother of my grandmother. So he's my lolo also, no? He was pala the family's first gay man. I didn't learn that until I was married with children. The family kept that a secret. Even he kept it a secret. So throughout his life, while he was alive. I mean, I never knew that. I also never knew the name that we had an ancestor who was a priest. He no okay. He was a what ang tawag doon? Parokya. Anong tawag doon sa priests who are not part of orders? They just ano no? Diocesan. Okay, so yeah, that's what he was, I guess. And then he became the lover, obviously, of a woman in our family. Otherwise, how will he become my ancestor, right? So he became a lover of the. And this story was not revealed to us either. I found out from reading my mother's memoir, and I'm like, wow, really? And for me, my reaction was the opposite of what my mother thought it would be. No, she's like, I said, why did? Kasi here's pa what happened to that priest. About halfway through my mother's stories, he disappears. I never hear what happened to that man anymore. And when I asked my mother, when she was already writing her memoirs, she only then told me, we never talk about him because he was a bad priest. He had a girlfriend, your great grandmother, like that. And I'm like, oh, di ba, how interesting. because we had some relatives who were very mestizo in their looks, and some who looked like me, more Chinesey. And this was because pala of all these intermarriages that had happened earlier. But that priest was particularly interesting because he had two sons. First, why did he disappear from the stories? He was pala part of that the movement that Gomburza was part of, for the what were they?
Secularization.
Huh? Ano? Oh, secular. No, basta he was part of that group of priests who revolted and or were said to have revolted. The three of them were executed, as we all know. This man who was my ancestor, whose name was Jose Guevara, and was the parish priest of Quiapo, binulgar ko na, anyway, it's in my novel, right? He was the parish priest of Quiapo. He and a few others were exiled to the Marianas. Maybe their sins were less than the three who were executed. And that's why he disappears from the family stories. He just disappeared, literally. And the last later I found out that the parish priest of Quiapo, this was his name, and he was part of that. So interesante, di ba? Also, he had produced two sons. One of them was the violinist. Was a violinist on the stage in Manila, di ba, may mga zarzuela, ganon. He was a violinist. They had an orchestra accompanying them all the time. He was a violinist, and he fell in love with a zarzuela star, and she with him, and they eloped. Okay. And then, they didn't elope. They got married. Oh, there's more to it. She was, okay. Anyway, he did have two sons. One became a violinist. He brought his wife and his family of small children to Naga in the Bicolandia because it was a boom town. And he was successful there. He set up his own theater company. They were doing very well. His wife, who had been a zarzuela star, was now a full-time housewife. But he joined the Katipunan. And one day, how his wife found out was, one day, the police at the time, the Guardia Civil, came and arrested him and threw out all his possessions into the street, including his children and his wife. They brought him to Manila, tortured him, and executed him in Bagumbayan. So he is one of the 16 martyrs of Naga. There's a monument there that I went to see the first time I went to do, what we do as teachers? Teacher training, yeah. We're a group of UP faculty who were invited to do teacher training somewhere in Naga, and Crip Yuson was kind enough to take me to the monument so I could have a picture taken with, it looks like a birthday cake. Is anybody here from Bicol? In the plaza, there's this monument, 3 tiers, yeah. White pa siya, diba? So it looks like a cake. And there are angels. I thought they were angels surrounding this tower. And yung pala, it was the martyrs. So, One of them was my lolo. Eh, baka naman angels na nga sila, di ba? So, okay, so it was an interesting discovery. And then I went on reading, and then I thought, this is my novel. And my mother was, my goodness, you're going to, what? It's going to be scandalous. In fact, she had told me, do not tell your husband what I told you, huh? About the priest. I said, what is my husband going to think about that? Is he going to divorce me because I had an ancestor who was a priest? Actually, he was very impressed. Kasi the priest became a katipunero, produced a katipunero, di ba? Okay. So, did I answer you?
Oh, sorry. So, when you have material such as your own, like personal history, and after the novel, after the novel was published, you continued to discover more about it. And Recuerdo was an epistolary novel, and I'm sure in the process you were actively, just as Amanda was, like researching about your family. Could you, for example, imagine yourself writing another novel about your family, and what would it look like, if ever?
No, I think I'm bored with my family already. No, the novel took a long time to write, and it took a lot out of me. In fact, after it was published, I felt so tired that I thought, okay, now I will write simple little stories. And I wrote Catch a Falling Star. That is the book that more people know. Diba? It's the only bestseller. Among the 40 or so books that I've written, that's the only bestseller. And it is because it's sold in schools to children. They treated it, the publisher decided to call it a young adult fiction. And I'm like saying, no, I'm not writing for children. I'm writing for adults. But I got, convinced because they told me that one school was already ordering books for their classes. So I was like, wow. Just like, that novel, this is not mine, the novel, ano ba yung Smaller and Smaller Circles by F.H. Bataka, no? That was required reading in Ateneo. And because the heroes were Jesuit priests, di ba? Oh, so they loved, they taught it. They were very, very simpatico, those two priests, no? So anyway, yun. So I wrote those stories very, very quickly. They are based on my life. I was Patricia Payatot, obviously, hanggang ngayon Payatot, no? And then, I just came out very, very easily, very quickly, hardly any rewriting. And then that was finished. I didn't write like that again. So. No, the answer is no.
Okay, the answer is no. So one thing I noted earlier was when you mentioned that historical novels aren't exactly written about the remote past. I thought about the fact that I thought it was about the remote past. I think I had an uncomplicated idea of being able as a novelist to see in its entirety something that is completed, and then from there you kind of enter in. And I think that's what interested me also about Linda T. Casper's The Three-Cornered Sun, because in school you read it, and then you take a quiz after and a half sheet of paper, and then you're done. You passively accept what has happened. And with A Three-Cornered Sun, because Linda T. Casper was able to see it from, 80 years after it happened, that's what really drew me in, that she was able to take readers right into the dust of the book. But then, and it was also interesting because I felt what Linda T. Casper also did very early on in the book was she distanced Jose Rizal from the story by actually putting him in a boat. Yeah, because whenever I look at that time, I always think about it. as Rizal, the what Carl Hall calls the colonial cancer, as happening at the present, at the at the time of Rizal. So being able to not just distance her cast of characters from Rizal, she was also able to distance herself from the time and yet give it a kind of present. Anyway, it's my long-winded like these were just what I was thinking as you were talking about that. And so I was thinking, how do we then know if we are writing the history of our time, that we are actually writing it? Like, no, for example, with Ninochka Rosca's State of War, or some of the other novels that were written in moments that were quite historic in themselves, even if they were not yet fully in the past. How do we know then, if you were a novelist writing today, how do you know that you are actually writing the history of your time, that it is therefore a historical novel?
I don't know. I don't think you are, and I don't think you need be worried about what's going to come out. I didn't sit down thinking I'm going to write a historical novel. No? And in fact, and it wasn't until I had the chance, much after, that I figured that actually if I were a teacher teaching this Philippine historical novel, I will include Recuerdo. But when I was doing it, it wasn't really my plan. No? I wanted to tell my mother's stories in a imaginative way, and I thought this would be what I should have done for my children, which I did not. And they came home with us, but they eventually both left and chose to live somewhere else. And I've always wondered whether their father and I are to blame for that. That we brought them out as children and then returned them. One was already going to graduate from high school. The other one was in, I think, grade 4 and they were so dismayed at being taken away from New York, which they loved, and come here. And we just said, look, we want you to have a country. You don't know your country, you don't know your cousins even, so we'll bring you home. So you'll always have that. And then after, when you're adults, you can leave again. It will be yours to decide. And they took us at our word and they left. So we did not succeed in that aim. No? So, but I'm thinking, when I wrote Recuerdo, I had none of that in mind. I just wanted to tell these stories. They were fascinating. And then more and more stories occurred to me. And that's it, the way it happened. No, I don't know whether, maybe one can. Different people find their subject matter differently, no? Some get intrigued with an idea, intrigues you. For some people, it's an image. For me, it's a character. So when I learned about that priest, I'm like, naku, I wish I had known him so I could tell his story. And what happened to him? And the sad part, the three Gomburza, at least they became heroes. So everybody remembers them to this day. Kami, we didn't even know the name of our ancestor. My mother only knew that he was parish priest of Quiapo. And then that became the basis for my research. Oh, so yeah, I just did, as I said when I was reading my parang as I'm creating the past for my Amanda, I was discovering my own past. No? Yeah, I think if you decide cold-bloodedly, I am going to write an important historical novel, no, about this period, it might not come out that way. No? It might not come out the way you wanted to.
If anyone has questions, I'm happy to open the floor to other questions. While you guys think of questions, I actually wanted to share today something Linda T. Casper had written about history and literature in the essay Literature Made of Fugitive Sons. It's actually a fantastic essay. Please, I recommend, if you're interested in historical novels, read that. But I pulled something out today to share. She says, Why does not literature let history alone speak for the past? because the events of the past, however remote, the wars and civil disorders and natural calamities are felt in the lives of individuals. History salvages the numbers of casualties and their distribution according to sides and battlefronts. Literature's concern is with the man who felt the bullet in his jaw, the woman running from an exploding church who discovers, on reaching safety, that the weight in her arms is a pillow, not her child. So I think literature really has a way of bringing out history that I think is really one of the reasons why someone like Linda T. Casper has truly succeeded. And great, there's a question. Please.
Hello, my name is Patrick and I am a student from 2AB Humanities. I wanted to ask three quick questions actually. The first one is actually what you actually discussed previously. What's your opinion on the quote, history is written by the victim?
By the victors. I completely understand what it's saying. No? I completely understand what it's saying. It's saying that if you win, you get the chance to write the history books. I mean, this is just the exaggeration, no? And then they will be published and then they will be taught. So your version is the one that people will hear. Yeah, the one whose manuscript was not accepted by the publisher for whatever reason is not going to be heard. You're right, unless some writer wants to write about that, which is what it's like. There's a novel I remember reading about a guy who's always number two. I forget what the title of the novel. Loser ba? Hindi naman siguro, no? Pero, but yeah, that's precisely, I think, why some people want to write, like in the case of Ninotchka Rosca, State of War. Who else? Definitely Gina Apostol, no? The idea to give voice, to speak for the ones who were not allowed because they lost. Especially when if the metaphor of Ninotchka is that the state of war is the Philippines. No? We are always in the state of war. And although I had not read that novel yet when I wrote mine, I thought, my God, that's the pattern in our family. The men die. So the first one was that priest who was exiled. In effect, he died for the family already, no? And then of course the priest, and then the violinist was executed, no? And then the generation that came after that is my parents' generation already, and my father fortunately was not killed, but the fiancé of my aunt, who was my father's best friend. They were students of La Salle, by the way, not Ateneo, unfortunately. So a lot of the men of that generation were killed, and that my mother's sister, who was a single woman until she died and took care of me. It was her fiancé who died, and they were supposed to have a double wedding, my parents and my tita and her boyfriend, but my father was not accepted into the army because he had something wrong with his lungs. So they went on with their marriage plans. My uncle to be joined the guerrilla, and so he told his girlfriend, my tita, let's postpone our wedding. It's too dangerous. They might use you to get to me. The sad part of that is that, shall I tell the story? Well, short lang. My parents were living in Paco. Manoling, the best friend of my father, was living in the Taft Avenue area. He sent word that he had heard from his contacts in the underground that magsosona ang mga Hapon. Alam ba ninyo yung magsosona? Yung they encircle a place and they hit it. And he heard it would be done in Paco. So he said in a note to my father, you come to me here in Taft. And my parents tried carrying me as a newborn baby. His information was wrong. The Japanese were in Taft Avenue. So my parents went home. Their house, the house of this man I'm talking about, that was one of the houses that the Japanese went in, killed everyone, including the maids, the neighbors who happened to be sheltering there. And he tried to stop it when he said they were looking for the guerrilla. Eh. And so he's like, ako yun, I'm the one, no? Just take me. Everybody was killed. One guy was spared, a houseboy, because he pretended he was dead. And a corpse fell on him. So naligtas siya, and he ran to Paco to inform my parents of what had happened. So in that generation, that's the one who died. No? Sumunod doon is my generation na, nag-martial law. Ang daming namatay noon, but not only men. The martial law did not have biases and killed both men and women. So we have to tell the story even if we lost.
But I have a slightly different take on that one. So, if you look at the three-cornered sun, it might be an interesting answer to your question because in the 1896 revolution, we didn't exactly win, right? So, even in the novel, I think Linda T. Casper was very conscious of that. And so she actually let her protagonist, Cristobal, kind of crumble, actually. Yeah, towards the end, like, well, no spoilers, but so, yeah, maybe not actually about the history is written by victors. I think the Three-Cornered Sun is an example that that's not the case all the time, at least.
Actually, I kind of want to comment on that because it's like because of how history is framed. Every time we discuss something about the war, there's always has to be some sort of result. But like because like this whole notion of like win a war, it's always the fact that there's a winner and a loser, but there's never the discussed about the after effects and what really got into that war in the first place. So that's actually interesting discussion. So yeah, thank you for answering my first question. Actually, my second question, I've been hearing about the word historiographic metafiction, and I wanted to say, like, because how fiction expresses itself is quite unique compared to nonfiction, and nowadays I've been hearing, especially like among like common readers, that we should not be reading fiction because it's not reliable. We have to read nonfiction. We need to know the exact, like, you know. So do you think that nonfiction stories, or like we can say quote unquote the historical novels, can evoke the same feeling as fiction itself?
Historiographic metafiction is a writing back. It is saying those things that were not said. In stories like The Great Philippine Jungle Energy Cafe, no, there are real people and there are ordinary people and there are invented people. No? It's one way that writers have found of writing about the underdog, the man who's not the hero, is not the one in the army, he's not the one who entered the guerrilla force, no, but he lived through everything too, all of these things. And here's the method that Cripio you chose was it's a kind of marvelous realism, you know, or postmodernism. That's what he used. Different writers have tried different strategies to tell that story of the silenced man or woman. No? Kaya the counterculture, not just in letters but in the other arts as well.
The message different when a character is described is just described of that scenario, or if the author expresses it through actual events that happen.
So the way I hear it, which is more effective, a narrator who simply describes the characters, or a narrator who editorializes?
Oh yeah, that one.
I think different readers will have different answers to that question. And myself, when my students ask me that, I say, what is the purpose of this piece that you wrote? Why did you write this? And then if you, what you want, you're an activist, for example, no? And you're trying to get people to rally to your cause. Is it better to directly say so? To be very active and angry and like that, or to write something very, very subtle and very sophisticated and like that. Obviously, the answer is, if that is your goal, to convert people to your own position, to rally them, you use the direct style. Because if you write something postmodern, hindi naman maintindihan. You won't get him to do anything. That became, by the way, I remember actually encountering that problem in one of the workshops of UP when I still do the workshops, but this was early on, where the students who were taking up malikhaing pagsulat, creative writing in the Filipino department, puro aktivista. And their kind of activism had to manifest itself in that way. We used to say, they take out the red flags, no? Is that effective, or is it more effective to write a very subtle love story, for example, between an activist who is in love with a woman who is the girlfriend of the leader of his party? You can make that entirely a love story, And I did read one like that, which was very well written. And then the activists in the panel, they didn't like it. They liked the one with the red flag waving, hammering the truth into your head. And I'm like, I don't know. As a writer, I'll choose the subtle and sophisticated any old day. But then if I'm an activist and I want to rally people, I write like something like the Noli. And then do not give it a happy ending talaga. Rizal never did. Both the Noli and the Fili end up with the characters miserable or dead. And very effective. O yan, ganyang kasama talaga yung mga Kastila. Di ba? Let's go. So depends on what you want to write. Well, no, depends on what is your purpose. I think that's the better answer, no? That's why with our majors, I try to tell them the first thing you explain to your students is that they have to have a poetics. They have to understand how that works, no? Why do I write the way I write, and for whom? What is it that you want to achieve when you're writing this particular piece? What is it that in general you want to achieve as a writer? And that will help you decide what strategy you're going to use, which is style, actually.
Okay, that's all for my questions. Thank you for answering them all.
Please, everyone, let's give them a round of applause, Dr. Ikondo.